The wind carried a thin whistle across the frozen fields, the kind that made even a strong heart feel smaller than it ought to be. Snow drifted in slow, lonely swirls, and the last traces of daylight faded behind the tall pines that lined the narrow road. On that cold Christmas Eve, when most folks in the valley sat close to their warm fires and thanked the good Lord for another year, 3 children stood at the edge of the world as they knew it, watching the home they had always trusted burn down to a quiet skeleton of smoke and crackling embers. The oldest girl, tall for her age and steady in her posture, tried hard not to let her voice tremble. She held the tiny hands of her younger sister and brother, pulling them close as the fire's glow dimmed behind them. Their coats were thin, dusted with snowflakes that melted into cold patches on their sleeves. The night sky above seemed wider than it had ever been, as if it meant to swallow them whole. They knew the meaning of loss long before this night, but losing the cabin where their family had lived for years carried a weight that felt different. It pressed against their ribs with every breath. Their father had gone to the mining ridge days earlier and had not yet returned. Their mother had taken ill the past winter, leaving only memories of lavender scent and soft lullabies. The children had learned to care for themselves in ways no child should. Still, the little cabin had been their shelter, their final piece of safety. Now the fire had stolen even that. The oldest girl kept her gaze forward, her jaw set, though her eyes carried the shine of tears she refused to let fall. She felt the heavy responsibility of keeping her siblings alive. Especially tonight, when the cold was sharp enough to bite skin and numb fingers within minutes, the youngest child, a small girl with curls that caught every snowflake in sight, stayed close to her older sister's legs. She whispered that her hands hurt from the cold, and her voice carried a quiet fear she could not hide. The middle child, a boy with a brave heart but tired eyes, held her other hand. He stood as close as he could, though his own shoulders shivered beneath his worn coat. He kept glancing back toward the small plume of smoke, as if still hoping something inside the ruins might be saved. But they all knew there was nothing left. The valley was quiet except for the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the distant cry of a lone owl. The road ahead was long, stretching toward the small town 2 miles away. The children had visited that town only a handful of times, usually to trade dried berries or small craft work with the shopkeeper. They had never walked its streets in the middle of a winter night, never approached it with fear nipping at their heels. Yet the oldest girl's mind was fixed on one thought. They had to survive, and going forward was the only choice. She told her siblings they would head toward the lantern lights that shimmered faintly in the distance. Those lights promised warmth, even if that warmth came from strangers who might not have enough space or food for 3 cold children on Christmas Eve. But strangers or not, the children had no choice. The town was hope, and hope was all they had left. They stepped onto the snow-packed road, the wind pushing against them with each step, the silhouettes of the burned cabin shrinking behind them until it became only a memory. With every footfall, the oldest girl thought of their father. She worried about whether he had reached the ridge safely, whether he would return to the cabin and find nothing but charred wood and silence. She wondered if he would think his children had been lost to the fire. The thought broke something inside her, yet she kept walking. The little ones needed her to be strong, so she tucked her fears deep inside and focused on the road ahead. The boy, though shivering, tried to act brave for his sisters. He kept his chin lifted and watched the trees around them, as if expecting danger to leap from behind the trunks. He had learned early that the world outside their cabin could be rough. Coyotes prowled in the dark, and sometimes desperate folks roamed the valley looking for anything they could take. But he also knew that once in a while the world showed kindness in places no one expected. He held tight to that belief now, even though the night felt unfriendly and the air burned his lungs. The youngest child walked with small steps, her boots barely making imprints on the powdery snow. She hummed softly to herself, the way she used to when their mother brushed her hair near the fire. Music calmed her, made her feel less alone. But tonight, her humming grew shaky, as if she understood that Christmas Eve was not supposed to look like this. Christmas Eve should have meant warm cider, shared stories, and candles glowing in the window. Instead, they walked in the dark, their breath turning to mist, their bodies trembling from the cold. They had been walking for nearly an hour when the wind picked up again, sharp and sudden. Snow whipped across the road, turning the world into a blur of white. The lantern lights they had seen earlier faded behind the swirl, disappearing as though swallowed by a storm. The children stopped, their hearts tightening at the same time. The snowstorm that had seemed distant was now creeping toward them. Closing fast, the oldest girl pulled her siblings close, shielding them with her arms. She had no shelter to run to, no fire to warm them. The storm would sweep over them within minutes, and she knew that if they stayed in the open, the cold would take them before sunrise. Panic rose in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She scanned the roadside for anything that might help. A broken wagon, a fallen tree, a ditch that might block the wind. But the storm grew thicker, the air colder, and the path harder to see. The boy pointed toward a small shape near the edge of the woods. At first it looked like a stump forgotten by a logger, but then they realized it was moving. Slow, steady, and toward them. A figure hunched and carrying something heavy across the snow. The children froze, unsure whether to run or stay still. Out here, strangers could mean danger. Yet danger already surrounded them in the form of a storm that showed no mercy. The figure came closer, step by careful step. Snow clung to the person's shoulders and hat, and their gait suggested someone used to hard winters and harder roads. The children could not make out their face, only the outline of their hands, gripping a small sack. The oldest girl felt her heart pound in her ears. She did not know if this person meant help or harm, but she knew one thing. They could not survive the storm alone. The figure stopped only a few feet away. The wind eased just for a breath, revealing the outline of someone far smaller than they had expected. Someone whose clothes were patched, whose boots were worn, and whose hands looked rough from long work. Someone who seemed humble in every way, yet stood there as if guided by purpose. The children exchanged glances, each wondering the same thing. Why was this person out here on a night like this? And what did they want with 3 lost and freezing children on Christmas Eve? The storm surged again, the snow thickening until the world blurred. The stranger lifted their head, opened their mouth as if to speak, and the oldest child felt her breath catch in her throat, knowing that whatever happened next would decide their fate. The stranger's voice was nearly carried away by the storm, yet the children still heard it. It was soft, a little worn, and carried the tone of someone who had spent many nights talking more to the wind than to other people. The words barely reached their ears, but they understood enough. The stranger asked if they were alone, and the older girl gave a small nod. The snow stung her eyes, and she kept her siblings tucked close, unsure of what this moment meant for them. The stranger leaned forward, brushing clumps of snow from their shoulders. Though the lantern light from the distant town had vanished behind the storm, a faint glow from the frozen sky lit the stranger's outline. Their coat was patched in many places, and their gloves looked thin. They carried a small sack tied with rope, the edges worn smooth, as though it had been used for years. Nothing about the stranger looked powerful or grand, but something in the way they stood, steady and calm, despite the storm, made the children pause. The youngest child hid behind her sister's legs, clutching the fabric of her coat. Her little voice trembled as she whispered if the stranger would hurt them. The older girl shook her head gently, though she had no real answer. She simply sensed that running away into the blinding snow would be far worse. The boy stepped half a pace forward, trying to show he was ready to defend his sisters if needed. Though the cold had nearly stolen the strength from his small hands, the stranger moved slowly so as not to frighten them and lowered the sack to the ground. Then they lifted one hand and pointed toward the woods behind them. Their voice rose above the wind for a brief moment. They said there was shelter nearby. A small hunter's lean-to, built years ago by trappers who had once traveled through the valley. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the storm until morning. The stranger motioned for them to follow. The children exchanged quick glances. The older girl felt torn between caution and desperation. The snowstorm had grown thick enough that even breathing hurt. Staying in the open meant danger, but following a stranger meant stepping into the unknown. Still, when the wind howled again and the youngest child began to cry softly from the cold, the choice became clear. They had to take the risk. They followed the stranger into the woods, walking single file through the deepening snow. The branches overhead caught some of the wind, but the storm still pressed around them like a wall. The stranger walked at a careful pace, making sure the children could keep up. They said nothing more, but their steps were steady and purposeful, as though they knew every stone and root beneath the snow as they walked. The oldest girl studied the stranger with quiet eyes. She noticed how the stranger's shoulders sagged, slightly as if carrying more than just the weight of a sack. They did not walk with the confidence of someone used to commanding others. Instead, they moved with the quiet strength of someone who had lived a hard life, someone who understood cold nights and hungry days. The girl wondered what kind of person walked alone through a storm on Christmas Eve. She wondered why fate had set their paths on the same road. The woods grew darker as they moved deeper among the trees. Snow clung to the branches above, forming long white lines that bent and creaked under the weight of the storm. The children slipped more than once, their boots sinking into soft drifts. But the stranger always paused long enough for them to regain balance. The boy tried to act tough, saying the storm wasn't that bad, but his voice wavered every time the wind surged. The youngest child didn't speak at all now. She simply kept her eyes fixed on the stranger's back, hoping that following those footsteps meant safety. After what felt like nearly an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing. At first, the children thought it was only another gathering of shadows, but then the stranger brushed away snow from a slanted wooden structure. It was small, barely tall enough for a grown person to stand in, but it had a roof and sturdy posts. The lean-to was made from rough logs and snow-stuffed gaps, built without much care, but with enough skill to withstand hard weather. The stranger stepped aside and motioned for the children to enter. The girl ducked her head and ushered her siblings in, brushing snow from their coats as they settled on the cold ground. The interior smelled of pine and old smoke, signs that trappers had once used it. The roof blocked most of the wind, and though the air was still cold, the shelter felt like a blessing after the long walk. The stranger entered last, shaking off the snow before sitting near the entrance. They reached into the sack and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were a few pieces of dried bread and a tiny tin cup filled with herbs that smelled warm and soothing. The stranger divided the bread into small portions, handing each child a piece. The children ate slowly, their hunger growing stronger now that they had stopped moving. The boy asked quietly why the stranger was out here. His voice carried curiosity mixed with caution. The stranger hesitated, then answered in a tone that suggested old wounds. They said they were headed toward the valley town, hoping to do simple work for winter wages. They said they had no family left and no home to return to. For years they had drifted between camps, farms, and lonely roads, trying to stay alive, by offering help whenever someone needed an extra pair of hands. As the stranger spoke, the older girl studied their face. She could see tired lines etched deep around the eyes. Those lines were not from age alone, but from life's hard turns. The stranger did not speak proudly or with self-pity. They simply shared their truth as quietly as the falling snow outside. The children felt something soften inside them. They were not the only ones who had lost something precious. They were not the only ones walking a difficult path. The storm continued pounding against the shelter, and the wind roared as if trying to tear through the woods. The stranger glanced toward the entrance often, listening for any change in the storm's voice. The girl could tell they were alert, perhaps expecting danger that came not from the weather, but from something else. She wondered if wild animals roamed the woods at night, or if desperate folks might stumble upon them. The boy wrapped his arms around himself, still shivering. He asked the stranger how long the storm would last. The stranger said storms like this had a mind of their own. Sometimes they cleared by morning, other times they stretched for days. But the stranger promised that once daylight broke, they would help the children reach town. There were folks in the valley who had good hearts, folks who would not turn away 3 freezing children on Christmas morning. The oldest child wanted to believe those words, but worry pulled at her. She feared what the townspeople might say when 3 children arrived without a parent. She feared they might be separated, She feared the town might turn them away or treat them like burdens. Every choice ahead felt heavy. The youngest child, curled up with her siblings, drifting into a half-sleep as the warmth of the shelter eased her shivers. But even in her drowsiness, she clung to her sister's coat, afraid of being left alone. The girl stroked her hair gently, humming the tune their mother once sang. The storm outside seemed to grow quieter for a moment, as though listening. The stranger watched the children with a thoughtful expression, their eyes softening. Then, in a low voice, they began to speak about the valley. They told stories of winters from long ago, when the river froze thick enough for carts to travel across. They spoke of holiday seasons when folks gathered at the old church with lanterns that glowed like fireflies in the night. They mentioned a certain family who once lived near the ridge, good people who offered warm meals to anyone who passed by. But as the stranger talked, the older girl noticed something odd. There were pauses in their words, quiet shifts in their gaze, as if they were leaving something out, a detail, a truth, a history tied to this valley that they were choosing not to reveal. The girl sensed a question forming in her mind, but she kept it to herself. The storm deepened once more, shaking the wooden posts. The stranger leaned forward as though listening to something far away. Their expression changed, not to fear exactly, but to caution. They whispered that someone else might be moving through the woods not far from where they sat. The girl felt her breath tighten. The boy straightened and looked toward the entrance. The shelter felt suddenly smaller, the night darker and the air sharper. The stranger lifted a hand, motioning for silence. Their eyes fixed on the shifting shadows, beyond the lean-to's opening. Something was out there, something heading their way. Snow hissed against the lean-to, as if the storm itself wanted to listen. The stranger's hand went to the small hatchet tucked beside their belt, not in a show of threat, but in the old habit of someone who had learned to stay ready. The children pressed together, their backs against the rough logs. The boy craned, his neck toward the opening, trying to see past the veil of swirling white, but the stranger motioned him down with a sharp look. A muffled crunch broke through the roar of the wind, then another. Slow, heavy steps, not the light, quick trot of an animal.
Ow.
Whoever or whatever was out there walked with purpose. The oldest girl felt the hair at the back of her neck rise. Stranger leaned forward, eyes narrowed, listening with the kind of focus that only comes from many hard winters on lonely roads. They whispered that it sounded like boots, maybe more than one pair. The girl's thoughts flew at once to the cabin they had lost. If someone had seen the fire from the valley, they might have ridden out to see what had happened. But the stranger's tense posture told a different story. These footsteps did not sound like a search party coming to help. They sounded like men walking who already knew where they were going. The stranger picked up a small piece of broken branch and stirred the snow near the entrance, erasing any tracks that led directly inside. Then they crouched low, pressing a finger to their lips. Every sound in the shelter quieted at once. Even the youngest child, half asleep moments earlier, sensed the change and tightened her grip on her sister's coat. Her wide eyes shone through the dim light like a frightened bird. The steps stopped just beyond the line of trees. Voices carried through the storm, low and rough. The words were broken by the wind, but a few slipped through. Someone cursed the weather. Someone else said the drifter could not have gone much farther. Another voice muttered something about missing supplies in the burned-out cabin on the ridge trail. The children stiffened, their cabin, their fire. Whoever these men were, they knew something. The stranger's jaw tightened. In a whisper, barely, louder than a breath, they told the children not to speak, no matter what they heard. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. The men outside trudged closer, their boots crunching in the snow just beyond the lean-to. One of them swung a lantern, and a faint glow passed over the shelter's entrance, casting weak light on the rough wood and the snow-packed ground. The light hovered, then stopped. One of the men said he thought he saw movement among the trees. Another scoffed, saying no one would be foolish enough to camp in these woods with a storm on. The first man said that drifters did all sorts of foolish things when they were hungry. He added that the storekeeper in town wanted whoever had been stealing from his back shed brought in by morning, storm or no storm. The oldest girl felt the stranger's words from earlier settle heavy in her chest. Simple work for winter wages. No family, no home. Wandering from place to place. Those were the same kind of things people said about thieves and troublemakers passing through old American towns. Yet the stranger had given up bread and shelter to keep the children alive during the cold night. The girl's thoughts tangled. Could both things be true? Could someone carry kindness in their hands and still have a shadowed past? Outside? The men argued about whether to keep searching. One wanted to press deeper into the woods. The other said they would freeze solid if they chased a drifter all night. They could pick up the trail after sunrise. The lantern light swung away, then back again, as if uncertainty itself moved the man's arm. Finally, the footsteps began to fade, swallowed by the storm as the men turned toward the valley road. Only when the last sound died did the stranger's shoulders sag. They set the small hatchet aside and let out a breath that had seemed trapped for a long time. The children watched them closely. The boy's voice came out rough as he whispered that those men were looking for a thief. He asked if the stranger was the one they meant. The stranger did not answer at once. Instead, they looked at each of the children in turn, eyes lingering on the youngest, who was still trembling. Then they spoke slowly. They said they had taken food once, in another town far away. Not out of greed, but because the winter had been cruel, and there had been a baby crying in a half-broken barn. They had left coins when work finally came, but the folks there never forgave the first wrong. Word traveled. Once someone was marked as a thief, it stuck, no matter what good came after. The girl listened, weighing each word. Her father had often warned her about trusting strangers too quickly. Yet he had also said that hunger could push even honest souls into dark corners. She thought of the winter they had lost their mother, of the nights when the cupboards had stood nearly empty and her father had gone out before dawn. Returning with game he would not explain. Survival did not always look clean. The stranger admitted they had passed through the valley town once before. The storekeeper there had refused to hire them and had locked his shed tighter once he caught sight of their ragged clothes. The stranger claimed they had not taken a single item from him. Yet when supplies went missing later, whispers had turned into open blame. It was easier to accuse a wanderer than to think a neighbor might have done wrong. The tension in the small shelter thickened. The children understood now that the stranger was not only running from the storm, but from the harsh judgment of people who held more power than they ever would. If the men from town found them all together, they might not care that the stranger had saved 3 homeless children on Christmas Eve. They would only see the drifter they had already, or decided was guilty. While the 3 of them huddled in the lean-to, another struggle was unfolding high on the mining ridge. Their father pushed through the snow with aching legs, the wind tearing at his worn coat. The mine shift had ended late, when a support beam cracked, trapping 2 men underground. Most of the crew stayed to dig them free, shovels ringing out in the frozen earth long into the night. By the time they pulled the men up, the storm had fallen hard. The foreman had urged him to stay the night in the bunkhouse, promising to let him ride down to the valley in the morning. But the father's thoughts burned with worry. His children were alone, and Christmas Eve meant little comfort without him. He refused the offer, insisting he knew the ridge trail better than any man there. Wrapped in a thin blanket over his coat, he set out on foot when the snow rose almost to his knees and the sky turned black. He did not know yet that the fire had eaten their cabin from roof to floor. He only knew the cold, the sharp pain in his lungs, and the stubborn hope that he would find his children sleeping by the hearth. With each step, the path blurred. He missed a familiar turn and slid down a shallow drop, landing hard. For several moments he lay there, stunned, before dragging himself upright again. The storm erased his tracks as quickly as he made them. Somewhere between the ridge and the valley, a father wandered, blind to the ruin that waited where his home had been, back in the lean-to. The children slowly learned pieces of this from the stranger, though not directly. The drifter spoke of hearing about a man who worked himself nearly to death in the mine, a widower who took double shifts whenever he could. The strangers in camp said he was trying to pay off debts on a small stretch of land, but the mine wages never seemed to stretch far enough. The children recognized their father in that half-told tale, yet they said nothing. Admitting who they were could change everything. The oldest girl wondered if the stranger already knew. Maybe the way the children looked, the way they spoke of the ridge, had given them away. The stranger watched them with a careful gaze, as if puzzling pieces together. They did not press, though. Instead, they asked simple questions about where the children planned to go. Once they reached town, the girl answered that they hoped to find the church. Their mother had always said that church was a place where no one would be turned away, especially at Christmas. Maybe there would be warm soup or blankets, or someone kind enough to help them send a message to the mine. She did not say aloud that her greatest fear was hearing that something had happened to their father on the ridge road. The stranger nodded slowly, but a shadow crossed their face. They knew the church. They knew the new preacher who had come from the city the previous spring, a man proud of his tidy records and careful rules. The stranger had once asked that same church for help. They had been offered a tract about hard work and faith and told there were no funds for wanderers. The stranger did not share this story with the children. Hope was a fragile thing, and the little ones needed it more than they needed the full truth of the valley's cold ways. Outside, the storm began to change. The wind shifted to a low moan, and the snow fell in softer layers. Dawn was still hours away, but a pale suggestion of lighter sky hung behind the trees. The stranger said they would leave as soon as the wind calmed. If they stayed too long, the men from town might pick up their trail again near the road. As the children rested against one another, fighting sleep, the stranger stared at their rough hands. They had spent a lifetime being pushed aside, distrusted in every town. They could easily slip away at first light, vanish into another valley, and let the children fend for themselves. That choice would keep them safe from blame and hard questions. Yet every time they looked at the youngest child's tiny fingers gripping her sister's coat, something inside them tightened. All the same, the risk was real. Helping these children meant walking back into a town that already had a name ready for them. Thief, vagabond, trouble. The stranger could hear the storekeeper's angry voice in their memory, promising to have them hauled in if they ever showed their face again. And now there were 3 witnesses. 3 small souls caught between need and suspicion. The main conflict of that night settled like a weight on everyone in the shelter. The children had lost their home and stood on the edge of losing their father, their security, even their chance to stay together. The stranger battled between self-preservation and the pull of compassion, knowing that one step toward the valley might save the children yet destroy what little freedom they had left. As the wind softened and the first hint of gray light touched the snow outside, the stranger rose slowly to their feet. The children watched, hearts pounding, waiting to hear whether this humble traveler would choose the safer path or the dangerous one. The decision hung in the cold air, unanswered. As dawn crept closer to the valley below, the stranger stepped toward the lean-tos, opening just as the wind settled into a low groan through the branches. The children watched every movement, their eyes following the stranger as though their fate hung on each quiet breath. The oldest girl rose to her feet too, steadying her siblings behind her. The stranger lifted a hand to feel the air outside. Testing the storm as a hunter tests the wind before taking a step into the wild, snow still drifted down, but it no longer struck with the sharp bite of earlier. The world had softened, though danger still pressed close. The stranger murmured that it was time to move. The road to the valley would be buried under fresh snow by now, making the walk harder and slower, but they had to try. If they waited for full daylight, the men from town might already be out searching again. The children gathered what little they had, which was only themselves. The youngest child blinked sleep from her eyes and reached for her brother's hand. Her small fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. She understood more than anyone gave her credit for. They stepped out into the pale gray morning. The snow came to the children's shins and pulled at their boots. The stranger led the way toward a narrow path between the trees. Walking with the knowledge of someone who understood winter's traps, the girl carried her sister when the snow became too deep, though her own arms trembled from the effort. The boy followed close, lifting his feet high through each drift. Their breaths rose like small clouds, floating and vanishing quickly in the cold. The woods creaked under the weight of the storm. Ice hung from branches and thin sheets that rattled when the wind shifted. The stranger kept glancing back, checking that all three children were still close. The responsibility on their shoulders seemed to grow heavier with each step. Every sound behind the group made the stranger stiffen. The memory of the men searching in the dark still clung to them as they walked. The girl began to notice little things she had missed before. A worn patch on the stranger's coat line where stitching had been done by hand, a limp in their stride, slight but constant, revealing an old injury. A small charm tied to their sack with faded twine, maybe a keepsake from long ago. These signs painted a picture of a person who had survived much and carried many burdens. She wondered if the stranger feared returning to the valley, or feared what would happen to the children if they did not. After nearly an hour, the woods thinned. Through the trees, the girl saw a faint shape, barely visible through the snowfall. A wooden fence. Beyond it lay the valley road. A strange mix of relief and fear washed over her. The road meant they were closer to help, but also closer to the men searching for the stranger. The boy leaned against the trunk of a tree to catch his breath. The youngest child shivered, her hair dusted with snowflakes like tiny stars. The stranger urged them forward again, saying they could not stop for long. They crossed the fence carefully, the woods slick with ice. Once on the road, they walked in a single line, leaving narrow footprints behind them. The valley stretched out in long rolling hills, all covered in white. Smoke from the town's chimneys rose in thin trails far in the distance. The sight should have brought comfort, yet the sky hung heavy and low, and the silence felt fragile as they moved toward the town. The stranger began to speak quietly, almost as if the rhythm of walking loosened the words. They told the children that the valley was not always as cold as it seemed. There were good folks living near the church, who sometimes baked bread to share. A woman near the general store took in strays when she could. A farmer at the far end of town kept extra blankets for travelers. Not all hearts there were hard. It was just that winters made people protect what little they had. The girl listened, trying to picture the faces of those kind folks. She hoped they would be the first ones the children met, not the suspicious ones who watched strangers with narrowed eyes. The boy asked whether the church would help them find their father. The stranger answered softly that it might, though they could not promise it. The girl's chest tightened, but she focused on walking. One step, then another. But as they neared the first bend in the road, movement caught the stranger's eye. A line of footprints, fresh and deep, came from the opposite direction. The stranger stopped so suddenly that the boy bumped into them. The stranger crouched down, brushing snow from the prints. They were boot prints, heavy ones. More than one set. The stranger rose slowly and told the children they needed to leave the road. The men were patrolling again. If they saw the stranger with 3 children, they would assume the worst. The girl asked where they could go. The stranger pointed to an old rail path that ran along the hill. It would take longer, but it kept them hidden from the road. They hurried toward the rails. The youngest child began to whimper, but her sister lifted her in her arms, whispering gently to reassure her. The stranger took the lead, guiding them onto the abandoned path. Snow covered the wooden planks, and the rails peeked out like old bones. The icy surface made every step a challenge as they moved. The stranger explained that the rails once carried goods from the valley mines, back before the war years changed everything. The line had been abandoned after a rock slide cut off the far end of the route. No one used it now, except for deer and the occasional wanderer. The girl felt a strange comfort walking on the old tracks, as if they carried the memory of many lives that had passed through the valley. Each with its own sorrow and hope. The wind shifted again, carrying faint voices from the road behind them. The boy turned pale. The stranger motioned for silence and pressed a hand against the rails, feeling for vibrations. None came. They quickened their pace, moving deeper along the path, but the tension grew heavier. The sky above began to brighten with the first hints of morning, yet the light only made their situation more precarious. The men would see footprints soon. They would search both sides of the road. The stranger knew this, and the children sensed it too. The oldest girl felt each breath tighten her chest. She wondered if their father had made it safely down the ridge, or if he too was wandering through the storm searching for them. their father, exhausted and frostbitten, was stumbling near the burned remains of the cabin at that very moment. He had reached the ridge trail hours later than he'd hoped, only to find smoke where his home should have been. His shouts echoed across the valley, calling his children's names. When no answer came, he had collapsed to his knees, burying his hands in the ashes. Then he saw the small footprints in the snow heading toward town. A spark of hope lit inside him, and he forced himself upright again. He began following the trail, limping and pushing through the cold with desperate determination. Back on the rail path, stranger and children continued moving. The youngest child finally cried from exhaustion, and the stranger took her. Lifting her gently in their own arms despite the strain it put on their tired body, the girl walked close beside them, afraid of falling behind. The boy kept glancing back in fear. Someone would appear on the tracks. The tension reached a breaking point when the stranger suddenly froze. Ahead, near a bend in the rails, smoke rose from a small ridge. A camp. The stranger's voice dropped to a whisper. Someone was ahead of them. The boy gripped his sister's hand. The girl felt her stomach twist. The stranger stepped carefully forward, signaling them to stay behind. They moved closer. The smoke drifted through the trees. A small tent had been pitched by the rails. A mule was tied nearby. Someone was stirring inside. The stranger stepped between the children and the camp, hatchet in hand. Not raised, but ready. The tent flap rustled. The children held their breath. The stranger braced themselves. A shadow moved inside. Someone stepped out. The rising sun lit the ridge with a cold glow. In the next moment determined everything about the day to come. The figure who stepped out of the tent squinted against the soft morning light, brushing frost from his sleeves as he straightened up. For a long moment, he didn't seem to notice the small group standing on the rails. He stretched stiffly, muttering about the cold night. But then his eyes lifted, and he froze mid-movement. The stranger held still, the children pressed close behind them. The man blinked, confused at first, then his gaze locked on the three children. Recognition changed everything in an instant. It was their father. He looked thinner than they remembered, hunched from exhaustion and limping from the long night's walk, but he was unmistakably theirs. His breath caught, and his face went pale. He whispered his oldest child's name in a strained voice, as though he feared saying it too loud would break the moment. The girl's knees gave out before she could answer. She ran to him, sobs shaking her whole frame. The boy followed, clinging to his father's coat with trembling hands. The youngest child wrapped her arms around his neck as he knelt to gather all three of them close. For a moment the world seemed to go quiet, the rails, the storm, the fear, all fading behind the warmth of that reunion. The father held them tightly, squeezing them as if proving they were real. Tears slid down his wind-burned cheeks, leaving wet lines through the frost clinging to his skin. He asked what had happened, why they were out here, how the fire started. The children spoke over each other until their voices tangled. They told him about the storm, the cabin burning, the long walk, and the stranger who had saved them. The father listened with wide, pained eyes, guilt settling heavy in his expression. He apologized again and again for not being there, though the girl stopped him, saying none of this was his fault. They had survived because they kept moving and because someone unexpected had helped them. It was only then that the father noticed the stranger standing a short distance away. The stranger kept their head lowered, as if unsure whether they were welcome in this moment. The father rose slowly, still keeping a hand on the children's shoulders. He approached the stranger with caution. His eyes held gratitude, but also the burden of a man trying to understand why a solitary traveler had stepped into danger for his children. The stranger spoke first, explaining how they had found the children alone in the storm. They said nothing about the men searching for them, nor the accusations that hung over the valley. They kept those truths tucked away. The father stepped closer, studying the stranger for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but the warmth behind it ran deep. He thanked the stranger with a steady voice, saying no man or woman could ever repay what had been done for his children. The stranger looked startled, as if unsure how to receive kindness. The children watched with silent hope, sensing something important unfolding. Before anyone could speak further, the sound of distant voices drifted toward them, faint but unmistakable. The stranger stiffened and turned toward the valley road. The father looked too, his expression shifting to concern. The voices carried up the hill, growing clearer. The men from the night before were out searching again. The stranger stepped back, instinctively moving away from the path. The children read the fear in that movement and realized this was not over yet. The father asked what was wrong. The stranger hesitated, then confessed the truth. They explained how the storekeeper had blamed them unfairly for stolen supplies, how the men were looking to drag them back to town in chains if they could. The father listened, his jaw tightening. He knew how quickly rumors turned harsh in small valley towns. He also knew that if the stranger ran now, the men might chase right into the woods. Right where his children were, he made a decision with the calm of someone who had lived through hard winters and harder trials. He told the stranger to stay with them, saying he would handle the men. The stranger shook their head, insisting they would only bring more trouble. But the father placed a firm hand on their shoulder. He said no good deed should lead to punishment, and that no one deserved to be hunted like an animal, especially not someone who had risked everything for 3 lost children on Christmas morning. The stranger lowered their gaze, touched and conflicted at the same time. The children gathered close to the stranger's side, silently showing that they stood with them. The father helped pack the small tent quickly, hiding any sign someone had camped there. Then he led everyone down the rail path toward town, taking a side trail that allowed them to avoid the voices behind them. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered valley. Their footsteps grew steadier as the worst of the storm faded into memory. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, smoke from chimneys rose into the calm morning air. The town looked peaceful, but the stranger hesitated, expecting the worst. The father placed a reassuring hand on their back and guided them forward. They walked straight to the church. The building's warm light shone through frosted windows, and a small gathering of townsfolk were inside, preparing hot meals for anyone in need. The preacher, a firm man with strict habits, stiffened when he saw the stranger. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, and whispers spread quickly. But before he could speak, the father stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. He told the full story, from the storm to the burned cabin to the stranger saving his children. He spoke without shakiness or doubt, saying that the stranger had risked their own life on a night most folks would not have stepped onto their porch. The father faced the preacher in the gathering, saying no one in this valley had shown the courage the stranger had. He added that anyone who wished to accuse them now would need to answer to him. His words shifted the air inside the church. The storekeeper, who had joined the gathering, looked uncomfortable as the crowd turned to him. People began murmuring, questioning why he had jumped to blame the stranger without proof. The preacher cleared his throat, sensing that whatever judgments he had made before no longer stood firm. Slowly he stepped toward the stranger and offered a quiet apology, saying the valley could use more hands willing to help others. In that moment, something softened in the stranger. Their shoulders eased, the fear in their eyes faded, replaced by something gentler. The children held onto the stranger's coat, smiling for the first time since the night before. The father asked the preacher if there was a spare room at the back of the church, just for a while, until he could rebuild what was lost. The preacher nodded, offering food and blankets without hesitation. The small room in the back became their temporary home. That Christmas Day, the townsfolk brought warm soup, quilts, worn coats for the children, and even a small wooden toy someone had carved long ago. The stranger sat with the children by the stove, telling quiet stories about wandering the old American valleys and the hidden kindness of places people overlooked. The children listened with comfort, knowing they were safe. Later that evening, the father returned from speaking with more townsfolk. He had been offered work again, more stable this time. A few neighbors pledged to help rebuild the cabin once the snow thawed. But the father's first words were for the stranger. He asked them to stay, at least for the winter, to share meals, warmth, and a place where they would not be cast aside. The stranger looked at the small family huddled together, the warmth of the church stove flickering across their faces, and for the first time in a very long while, the stranger said yes. The children drifted to sleep that night beside the fire, their father resting close by, the stranger seated beside them like a quiet guardian. Outside, the snow fell softly, peaceful now, as though the valley itself had decided to calm. They had lost their home on Christmas Eve, but in the deepest cold, salvation had come from the humblest of hands. And in that humble act, a new beginning took root, stronger and warmer than the storm that had tried to take everything from them.